Man, life on Monkey Paw Island sure is paradise. There's fish in the lake, food on your plate, ignore that. I sure hope no European power on the verge of industrialization shows up to destabilize the local politics and strip the island of its resources. Oh, that's not good. Hey everyone, a few months ago I took a look at a game called The Case of the Golden Idol, and it was great. I really enjoyed it, and I've been wanting more from Color Grey Games ever since. I said in that first video I wanted to see more of this world. I wanted to see the blank spots on the map filled, and in Golden Idol's two DLC packs, the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire, I got exactly that. So let's talk about them. But before I get my hands into the guts of these games, if you enjoy the video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share the video around, because YouTube sure won't. Also, if I mispronounce anything, I apologise. To quickly recap, The Case of the Golden Idol is a mystery game where you solve murders by filling in the blanks with words sourced from around each scenario. It told the story of the titular idol and the path of destruction its wielders wrought upon the island nation of Albion across a 50-year period, and that tale was brought to a pretty definitive end by the time the players reached the end credits. So rather than look forward, the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire cast their gazes into the past to tell the tale of how Albert Cloudsley and Oberon Geller ended up at this cliff top overlooking Monkey Paw Island this fateful stormy morning. Each pack contains 3 scenarios, and together they form 2 extra chapters that fill in just about all the blanks of this setting and its stories that you could ever wish for. That said, I do not recommend playing them before the base game, not because you'll be lost in terms of narrative. The story told in the DLC flows pretty seamlessly into that of the base game. No, you should save the DLC for last, because they're really hard. Oh, you enjoy The Case of the Golden Idol? Here, solve this. This scene is the first scenario of the Spider of Lanka, and it is more complicated than pretty much the entire base game. This is not a starting point, this is endgame content, and it only gets more difficult from here on out. The gameplay is mostly unchanged from the base game. Each scenario presents you with a moment frozen in time and a murder to solve. You still collect words from around the environment on the exploration screen. You still use them to fill in the blank spaces on the thinking screen. But there are way more words per scenario, and there are way more things to think about. You can't brute force these missions. You have to pay attention to pretty much everything going on in each scenario. There might still be a handful of red herring words to collect, but there are no documents you can safely ignore, no dialogue you can get away with overlooking, because unlike in the base game, there are some instances of important words that are clickable and others in the same scenario that aren't. Playing with hints enabled, it won't be a big deal, but I did find it odd sometimes that I could click on a really important word like a name, and other times I couldn't. Things get busy pretty quickly on the thinking screen, and like with the base game, it doesn't always ask you to provide information on the same things. 1 or 2 scenarios might still ask you to put names to faces, but more often than not, you'll find yourself put on the spot about the rules of a local card game based only on the tables around the room, or the history of an isolated community told through pictures they themselves are no longer capable of putting in the right order. There were some moments where I found myself overwhelmed with the amount of stuff the thinking screen required of me and how hard each individual section seemed to be. But like with the base game, once you manage to get a foothold in any given scenario, once you start pulling at one loose thread, the whole thing can open up in seconds. The Spider of Lanka is more or less the Case of the Golden Idol on expert mode, but the Lemurian Vampire does actually introduce a new gameplay mechanic. Its 3 scenarios don't just present you with a single moment frozen in time, but 2 or 3, and each of them are essential in solving the mystery at the level's core. Something said at one point in time might only make sense in another, and it's really cool to see events happen in something much closer to real time than the month or year-long skips the base game usually dealt in. Overall, I really like the mechanic because it allows you that moment-to-moment depth, and also because it seriously ups the challenge. But as much as I love how complex things get, it comes at a cost. The Case of the Golden Idol had a fantastic gameplay loop where you could switch between the exploration screen and the thinking screen with a scroll of the mouse or a touch of a button. There might have been a lot of levels to explore and a whole bunch of words and clues to find, but the thinking screen was always available in its entirety. The Lemurian Vampire breaks that formula by adding layers to the thinking screen that you have to toggle between to access certain information, such as the names of characters you already know that don't really come up that often in conversation. On the one hand, it's good that you're not asked to constantly provide trivial information, given there's far less content to work with in the DLC packs, and you want to make each thinking screen count, but I don't think putting that info on a tab you have to toggle on and off was the solution to the problem of where to store it. Having to cycle through different tabs of the thinking screen completely breaks the flow of gameplay. But I also understand that with how complex things get in the Lemurian Vampire, there was really no other choice but to expand the scope of the thinking screen in order to maintain the level of challenge. It's certainly not bad, but it can be clunky, and if I had to sum up the Lemurian Vampire in a word, it would be just that, clunky. It sets out to introduce so much by way of its new mechanics and increased complexity, and even its story, that it's much more obvious when it stumbles. The Spider of Lanka is less ambitious in terms of gameplay, but both feel chafed by the limited scope of a DLC pack. I honestly think they could have been expanded out to something larger, because there is enough here to carry an entire game. And the extra development time definitely would have helped smooth out some of their more obvious shortcomings. But that's if you take both DLC packs as a whole. If you're just after more case of the goldenidol gameplay, the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire will more than scratch that itch. It might not be as tight a loop as the base game, but it will definitely satisfy. The presentation of the DLC, like the gameplay, is much the same as in the base game, but there are some interesting differences. The DLCs are set in this world's equivalent of 18th century South Asia rather than Europe, and that shift in setting has informed the art direction and sound design. The character models are a little less grotesque in general, and the exaggerated features reminiscent of old political cartoons have been scaled back, presumably to avoid unfortunate comparisons to racial stereotypes, and that's fine. There are still plenty of gonks like the Raja, his son, and this guy who looks like he walked right out of an old Rocky and Bullwinkle episode. Another change is that the characters are a lot more animated than in the base game when you click on them. They've got a little more three-dimensional depth to their models and a lot more spring in their step. Just compare Albert Cloudsley from the original game to how he is here. I guess his mission in Lanka's got him nervous. They move so fast now, I almost wonder if it's a bug, like they're actually meant to be slower but my computer's running the program at the wrong speed, so it looks like everyone's just taken a few too many puffs from Bertie's pipe, if you know what I mean. Crack! In good a time as that sounds, I think it might be a little too much movement. It doesn't convey urgency like in the base game, it conveys a graphical glitch. At least the little movements around each level remain much less skittish, and they retain the sense of vitality they provided in the main game too. The levels themselves still look gorgeous. Lanka and its kingdoms are a pretty obvious stand-in for Sri Lanka in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the Spider of Lanka reflects that influence with its use of pagodas and stupas instead of the country mansions and pastoral cottages of the base game. Even though you only get to see a small amount of Clusapur, you can feel its layers of history through the way you see it. There's the sense that the city is a much larger place than the little slice of it you get to see. The DLC soundtrack, once again composed by Kyle Misko, incorporates sitars, vocals and drums, I think tablas, into the mix that give it a different feel without sacrificing the style of the base game's music. We're still very much in the world of the Golden Idol, just in a different part of it. The Spider of Lanka comes with 2 new tracks, both around 6 to 7 minutes long, but the Lemurian Vampire takes it one step further by boasting 41 minutes of new material. The second DLC takes place on Monkey Paw Island, whose inhabitants appear to be based on Pacific Islanders, so the soundtrack incorporates that influence into the music. There's more percussion, more woodwind, but as the tension rises and the story builds toward a climax, more and more instruments and motifs from the base game and the Spider of Lanka start creeping into the mix as characters from those stories rise to prominence in the plot. But the reason there's so much of it is because the music of the Lemurian Vampire is tied directly to its new time period mechanics. There are only 3 base tracks, one for each level, but they each have 2 or 3 slightly different versions depending on what time of day you're currently in. Combined with the different colour palettes for each time period, it really creates the sense that time has actually passed. They're such little things, but without them the mechanic would feel kind of incomplete. It needs those extra details to work, like the minimalist movement around each level, and it helps that the music for both DLC packs is fantastic. I really enjoy the look of Monkey Paw Island 2. It's one of the Case of the Golden Idol's first and biggest mysteries. What kind of place would you find such a cursed object as the titular trinket? What sort of people call it home? Has the Lemurian Empire survived there in some way? The game provides answers to all those questions and does it really well. It would have been so easy to fall back on old stereotypes about any number of non-European or non-Asian peoples, or just gone all in on some insensitive, they're completely fictional, and actually I've written it so even the other local people who exist in real life don't consider them human, therefore it's okay to vilify them, portrayal that pops up every now and then in movies like Bone Tomahawk. But the Lemurian Vampire found a really interesting third option that I think worked perfectly. Monkey Paw Island and the city of Xenopolis was once an outpost of the Lemurian Empire, and you can see the ruins of their golden age all over the place in these crazy structures half buried by dense jungle, but the original inhabitants are long dead, just like the empire they called home. Monkey Paw's current inhabitants are an island commune of exiles who arrived much later. They might have taken a few of Xenopolis' more impressive structures for themselves, but most of their homes are wooden lodges with thatched roofs. They have their own culture, their own character, their own day-to-day issues that, while different from the political intrigues or secret societies of the Spider of Lanka and the base game, remain clearly human. Thus, the mystery of the island's past is maintained, but there's still room to tell an interesting story with ordinary people having to deal with ordinary things, and no need to indulge in anything problematic. Where the Lemurian Vampire stubules? What the fuck is that? Stubules? What am I fucking saying? Where the Lemurian Vampire stumbles visually is in the details. The Case of the Golden Idol used exaggerated character designs and flashy clothing to help the player differentiate so many characters from such a large cast. The Lemurian Vampire has a surprising number of characters for a DLC pack, but there are fewer unique faces and almost no outfits to help tell people apart. I think this might be the first time the game has reused faces and hairstyles between characters, albeit only for secondary or minor ones. The lead characters remain obvious wherever they happen to be, though they lack any sort of personal garments that make their identities clear beyond their faces. There's also this background, which I think is the only piece of digitally altered real-world photography in the game. Sure, there's been the occasional 3D model, but those have only ever been used for vehicles. All of the woods and jungles seen thus far have been done in the game's art style, drawn rather than crafted from a pre-existing photograph, and to see that change here is jarring. It's another way in which the Lemurian Vampire is clunky, and another reason, along with the basic costumes and reused character models, I think the second DLC may have been rushed out the door before it was ready. Again, it just seems a bit too ambitious for what is a DLC pack. The Spider of Lanka doesn't have any of these problems, in fact its details are some of my favourite things about it. I love how the DLC uses different fonts to denote the language being spoken, and different coloured ink to identify who is writing what document. It takes a little attention and maybe a notepad and pencil to jot it all down, but once you get on top of the little details, the story will pretty much unfurl open before you like a flower. And what a story it is! Prequels are arguably harder to write than sequels because the ending is already written in stone. How do you build tension when you know certain characters can't die, no matter how much peril they're placed into? In a story with so many unanswered questions, how do you engage with the mysteries without ruining what made them so interesting to start with? If it was a story worth telling, wouldn't the original work have started here, rather than when it did? The Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire managed to sidestep these problems and did so in interesting ways, such as how they're set many years before much of the base game in a completely separate part of the world, with only a couple of returning characters given important but overall secondary roles in the plot. The best comparison I can make is to the TV show Fargo. Each season is set in the same universe, but they all take place at different times. They focus on different characters and different conflicts, but familiar names and faces do pop up every now and then in interesting or unexpected ways, and the same is true here. Albert Cloudsley and Oberon Geller are the only characters from the Case of the Goldenidol to even be alive at this point in the timeline, but they're only minor figures here. Their quest might be a canonical inevitability, but it's only a small part of the tales told in the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire, which are as grand as the base game both within themselves and when taken together. The Case of the Goldenidol is a game that had a large cast, but no clear protagonist. The DLC packs do, and it's Zabiri Kera, the son of a Lemurian priest, come to Lanka as part of a religious ceremony regarding a kingdom's line of succession. As a Lemurian, he's still a bit of an outsider, but unlike many of the characters in the base game, he's well aware of his people's past and the technology they wielded. If you play the DLC packs at the end, as is intended, then like Zabiri, you're a stranger to the new setting, but not its horrible secrets. Though unlike Zabiri, if you've played the base game before, you might think twice about trusting the erstwhile Dr. Geller. Even without their chance meeting at the Yellow Lily, Zabiri seems to be a murder magnet. Guy can't walk 10 feet without tripping over a fresh corpse, which is probably why he so regularly gets accused of killing them in the first place. In the Spider of Lanka, he takes more of a passive role in the plot, but you can't really blame him with so many powerful people operating around him. The Raja and his court, his father Yupik Kera, European observers such as Albert Cloudsley present in Lanka to represent the interests of the Seven Seas Company, plus the titular Spider whose motivations remain unclear until the very end. It's only in the Lemurian Vampire, where those established power structures are swept away in a shipwreck, that Zabiri finds his footing and takes an active role in the story, fully aware of the truths behind the myths of Monkey Paw Island's inhabitants. His character arc from frivolous student to hero is, like everything in the DLCs, mostly relegated to the background, but I think it works. He anchors the focus of the story in a way the Goldenidol itself can't anymore, because unlike in the base game, it's usually nowhere to be found. You know it's coming, and in some small and clever ways it's there right from the very beginning, but it seems so far from the web of political intrigue the Spider of Lanka weaves that when it is finally brought up by name, it's a genuine surprise. Which brings me to spoilers, so if you want to discover the mysteries yourself, skip to here. The Spider of Lanka is less about the goldenidol and more about the Seven Seas Company meddling in the political affairs of a foreign power to destabilize the region and make it more readily available for exploitation. Zubiri Kera is just a pawn in that web of intrigue, a distraction the Spider can wave around in public with one hand while he sets his traps in secret. Like I said, he's in Clusapur as part of a delegation from Lemuria meant to facilitate the ritual. The ritual is meant to determine which of Raja Rabea's children will succeed him on the throne. It's this grand moment of spiritual and physical resurrection where the successor, if chosen by a higher power to rule, will return from the dead after getting sliced in half with an axe. It's also a sham, a magic trick performed by the Lemurians to ensure the royal bloodline flows in their preferred direction. But the Lemurian Empire is not the superpower it once was. Albion's the rising star of the world stage now, and the Seven Seas Company wants in on Lemuria's turf. They've already done a pretty good job of finding a foothold in Lanka anyway. Clusapur, like any port city, is a pretty multicultural place, which is how our story begins in the bloodbath that is the Yellow Lily after a particularly over-enthusiastic card game tournament. Zubiri won one hand too many, Bill Price doesn't like to lose. One thing led to another, and one stab, spin, whack, throw and gunshot later, the only two left standing are the young Lemurian and one Dr. Oberon Geller. As with so much of the Golden Idol's plot, its significance only becomes apparent toward the end of the Spider of Lanka. At first glance, it's just a great way to throw the player back into the action. Can't believe this guy slept right through it all. Zubiri's luck doesn't improve once he reaches the Raja's court. He, his father Upik, and their assistant Ari find themselves caught in the spider's web again when the ritual of rebirth is sabotaged. Raja Abeya's daughter Anula is dead, killed when Ari failed to lower her out of the axe's path during the ritual. Unsurprising really, given Ari herself is also dead, poisoned inside the ritual box. Given no one but the royal family and the Lemurians were allowed to enter the stupa, the blame has been placed firmly on Zubiri's head. Albert Cloudsley, who definitely didn't help facilitate the accident on behalf of the Seven Seas Company, is absolutely aghast, as is just about everyone else. There are an absurd amount of pieces to this puzzle, and no one present has all of them. Zubiri was smitten with Ari, but she only had eyes for the Raja's Blademaster Jayan G. Could it be that the murder was a crime of passion and Anula's death an accident? It's hard to say, because Spymaster Putra's son has uncovered what he thinks is a conspiracy to place Raja Abeya's son Tisa on the throne, but it seems too easily found to be real. Sun and G had a little conspiracy of their own to ensure Tisa ended up passing the test, but given Anula favoured the Blademaster too, maybe Ari killed her to remove the princess as competition for his affections. Another crime of passion if true, but how then did she herself die? Good old Bertie had instructions from the company's home office to hide a surprise gift in an out-of-the-way place. This whole mess has nothing to do with him. Upik doesn't care about the truth, he just wants to save his son's life, and the Raja is willing to spare him in exchange for certain Lemurian secrets. It's a convoluted scenario, and even now, after playing through it multiple times, I'm still not entirely sure how all the pieces fit together, but I can at least put a name to Anula and Ari's killers. None other than Prince Tisa himself. Ari might have favoured J&G, but she did not waver in her duty. Tisa failed the test fair and square, but unfortunately for Ari, Anula, and all of Gamini, someone had already passed along a poisonous cricket to him as a gift, courtesy of the Seven Seas Company. No one else was allowed in the stupa, so he just tossed it in the box and let fate take its course. Tisa's crimes go unpunished, but at least Zubiri is spared. Future Son might have been caught off guard by the princess's death, but he's not Spymaster for nothing. He figured out the culprit must be one of the investors of the Seven Seas Company owned Titania printing house, and has caught the spider terrorizing Lanka, or so it seems. In truth, the man behind the mask is UKIP, sent out into the ambush as a distraction while the spider made their getaway from the printing house. It wasn't completely clean, a guard still ended up dead, and that's the murder you're asked to solve, but the spider got what they wanted and then just got away. It's only by reading the notes the spider left behind for Future Son that the truth becomes apparent. The spider was none other than Oberon Geller. I know, shocking, right? Okay, it's not exactly unexpected. Is the spider an idiot? A sleepy boy? These random people we've never heard of before and will never hear of again? Or the guy who obviously did it? What's more of a surprise is why. He was asked to destabilize the region for the Seven Seas Company, sure, but there was a personal element to this. There are some very old, very interesting myths about the Lemurian Empire, and it just so happens free Lemurians were in Lanka for the ritual of rebirth. Oberon Geller orchestrated the massacre at the Yellow Lily in order to exploit Lemuria's cultural norms of gratitude and honor. In thanks for saving his life, Zubiri told Oberon the secret of the rebirth ritual, which he then used to help sabotage the event. I already mentioned how Yupik managed to convince Raja Rabeya to spare Zubiri's life by revealing a great secret, and he also went on to reveal that same secret to Oberon Geller in thanks for saving his son's life to begin with. But just because he was beholden by Lemurian culture didn't mean Yupik was going to let the spider get away with all he'd done. He informed Putreson and planned to ambush the spider at the printing house. Unfortunately, Oberon had been forewarned, which is why it is now Yupik caught in the Spy Master's ambush, and not the spider himself. Now Oberon and Bertie are free to sail wherever the winds take them. Oh no. Yeah, the secret everyone wants from Yupik is a map to the golden idol. This can only end in tears. The Lemurian Vampire begins with the Lankan ship winning the race to Monkey Paw Island, but that head start ends in tragedy during a storm. The Raja is lost in the shipwreck, his hopes of eternal life dashed across the rocks, but Zubiri, Jayanji, and Tisa all survived. Where's Putreson? Oh, he's just back in Lanka. Yeah, we'll never see him again. Anyway, turns out Monkey Paw Island is home to a commune of exiled Lemurians along with a being known only as the Tower Dweller. It's been on the island for longer than anyone can remember, and given what it holds in its hands, that's not really a surprise. If you've played the base game, you know what the Golden Idol is capable of. The Tower Dweller is just another in a long line of vampires using the idol to steal the years from other people, as seen in this first scenario, where it kills Sutal. But that's not really the mystery here. The mystery is just figuring out who everyone is. The Xenopolis commune is unlike anything seen in the base game or the Spider of Lanka. Instead of an absolute monarchy or a fascist dictatorship, it's a small group of hunter-gatherers led by a council of 4, who each represent the different but overlapping groups of men, women, children, and farmers. The council's too busy discussing how to deal with their new arrivals to introduce themselves. It's only by listening to the gossip around Xenopolis that you find out who each of them are and where their loyalties lie. There's Verlis Momgo, the Guardian of Men, Kula Sterna, the Guardian of Women, Lavumata, the Guardian of Children, and Kruplu Zano, the Guardian of Agriculture. None of them particularly like each other, but with the Tower Dweller a constant threat to everyone's safety, they're willing to work together to keep people safe. And just as well, because like I said, he's on the warpath. Zubiri and Jayan take to the new lifestyle pretty well, but Tisa, having lived all his life getting what he wants, is having a tougher time of it. But with Sutal now dead, and the position of Sentinel once again open, it seems there's a chance of moving back up in the world. Sorry Zubiri, should have been faster. Or maybe he was right to hesitate, because the next we see of him, Tisa's dead. Tower Dweller stripped him right to the bone, so it appears. The Lemurian Vampire Strikes is probably the hardest scenario in the entire game, which is saying a lot. It takes place across the days leading up to Tisa's murder, and there is a lot to take in. Tisa didn't get to where he is on his own. He has an accomplice on the council in Kula, and a plan to deal with the Tower Dweller using Zubiri's secrets of Lemurian technology. Right after everyone on the island gives him their gemstones, their fruit juice, their fish, their honey, and their bodies. Tisa has his sights on Sahilia Een, but the feeling is not mutual. She'll agree to a single night if it gets him to back off, but no more than that. One night is more than enough to slit his throat, and it would explain how she got past the locked door to Tisa's room, but waking up as a bag of bones is a little beyond one person's abilities. The Tower Dweller seems the obvious culprit, given the threatening messages he's left across the walls of Xenopolis, but the shoe still doesn't fit. It takes a lot of snooping and a deep dive into the culture of promise in present-day Xenopolis, but eventually the truth is revealed. Sahilia only agreed to humor Kula and spend the night with Tisa because she'd already secured Lavumata's promise that she would stop it from happening. They switched places, under the assumption Lavumata would just talk him him down, but when she emerged to find Tisa already drugged with spotted gourd seeds, she killed him, tossed his corpse into the lake to be consumed by piranha, and placed the skeleton of a long-dead sentinel in his place. The Tower Dweller had nothing to do with it, but why would Lavumata kill Tisa when she's the guardian of children? Wouldn't she want the Tower Dweller gone as well? Maybe the Dweller's destruction wasn't worth the cultural upheaval. Either way, it's a moot point, because Zubiri takes the blame for it anyway, and once again ends up in jail, just in time for Bertie and Oberon to finally catch up in their quest for the Golden Idol. The DLC ends with the less than amicable departure of two explorers, and this is where the Lemurian Vampire's clunkiness really rears its head in terms of narrative. Mainly because there's no murder to solve. There's the Tower Dweller, I suppose, but it was never alive to begin with. It was an ancient automaton of the Lemurian Empire, programmed to respond to voice commands with use of the Golden Idol. The true identity of the Lemurian Vampire is none other than Lavumata, who discovered the Tower Dweller many centuries ago, and has been using it to keep herself young ever since. With Zubiri's help, she even manages to get her hands on the Golden Idol, but her ownership of it is short-lived. Jian-Ji frees Zubiri while Albert Cloudsley and Oberon Geller march on the Tower Dweller with the rest of the council and the wonders of modern artillery. After blowing the Tower Dweller to bits, they chase Lavumata down below the surface of Monkey Paw Island, and it's there they have their final confrontation. Lavumata loses the idol, but canon dictates that so too must Zubiri. It falls into Oberon Geller's hands, and the two explorers make their less than amicable departure after destroying the path behind them. We already know what happens to them. Their victory is only momentary, but for Zubiri and the other characters, this is all the ending we get. Just a single frame in a 10-second cinematic that offers next to no closure. Zubiri is offered a position on the council, sure, but what about everything else? What happens to Lavumata now that her deceptions have been revealed? What happens to everybody now that the threat of the Tower Dweller is gone? Furthermore, what about Putra-san back in Lanka, and the Seven Seas Company, and Sleepy Boy, who seemed like a setup for something that never happened? The base game left a lot of world building blank, but never the story itself. Everyone got an ending. Here, the final scenario just feels very rushed, and a lot of plot threads and character arcs feel unresolved. Taken individually, the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire have very specific narrative focuses, but together they don't quite cohere into the complete story they are clearly trying to tell. Don't get me wrong, I love the twists. The surprise of the Spider's motivations in Lanka is great, and the reveal that the Tower Dweller is a puppet is fantastic. I always love to see sci-fi concepts like that placed in old historical periods where they feel out of place. Same with the writing board hidden in the ruins of Xenopolis. Lavumata is a really cool villain too, a total contrast to Lazarus Hearst of the base game given she's a woman, she works entirely in the shadows, and she's trying to preserve a utopia she's already built for herself with the Golden Idol rather than bring one into being. Her reasons for wanting Tisa dead become a whole lot clearer knowing her past, and it's clever in an unsettling way when you realise she takes her position of guardian of the children to include everyone on the island, given her unnaturally long lifespan. Her downfall is just as satisfying and deserved as Hearst's, Geller's, and Tisa's. The final scenario is such a great climax on paper, but its execution, I think, is really clunky. The final level of the main game took place after all the action had already ended, but here with the new time period mechanic you have the opportunity to see any point during the series of events, and the chosen just feel a little lacking. Given it's the final level we'll probably ever get for the game, I would have loved it if it had gone all out with 4 or 5 time periods, and, you know, an actual murder to solve. But putting the structure of the final scenario aside, the ending just feels like it's missing any sort of satisfactory closure. It feels rushed and unfocused, and it's why I wish the DLC packs had been expanded out into their own full game to fulfill the potential that is so clearly there, and bring it home in a way that doesn't feel so clunky. It still spins a good yarn, and it's still worth experiencing, but it's definitely not as tight as the base game, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't left a little disappointed by the time I reached the thank you screen. The case of the Golden Idol told a complete story. There may have been questions left unanswered, spots left blank to fill in later, but it was, in itself, a whole and satisfying narrative. As someone who was left wanting more, in terms of story, in terms of setting, in terms of gameplay, in terms of challenge. The Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire filled in those blanks in ways I really liked, but in doing so they opened up a whole new mystery box of unanswered questions that left me a little disappointed by the time I was done. The stories told are still complete, they still end, but they feel rushed. They clearly didn't get the polish they really needed to shine as bright as the base game. The same was true of the gameplay and the presentation. If you want more Case of the Golden Idol, then in the Spider of Lanka and the Lemurian Vampire, that's exactly what you'll get. They might be rough around the edges, and the final scenario especially felt very abrupt for what it was, but I can't imagine playing the Case of the Golden Idol again without them as part of the experience. I can't help but admire the ambition on display. Whatever Color Grey does next, whether it's a return to this world in a different age, or something completely new, I just hope it gets the development time it needs to soar as high as the Case of the Golden Idol, because this was only the slightest of stumbles. I don't want to see it turn into a fall. Thanks for watching.